Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and welcome to Karmic Patterns Vedic Astrology podcast. Today is Wednesday, January 10th, and today's podcast topic is the Mercury Retrograde phases of 2018. There are three of them, and I'll talk a lot about the astronomy of Mercury Retrograde, the astrological indications of a retrograde planet and Mercury specifically. We'll go through all of the dates of Mercury retrograde phases for 2018 and the signs and nakshatra movements of Mercury through the retrograde phase, particularly in March. I won't go through the entire year in that kind of detail, just the upcoming one. I'll probably do the other two later on in the year when it's more relevant. I'll also talk to the aspects and influences to Mercury while it is retrograde from other planets. And we'll look at the Mercury retrograde influence to the natal chart by sign. A lot of you have requested that I do a forecast by sign, and I am going to include that, but I have to do it with one caveat, and that is that the individual birth chart is much more complex than just the rising sign. And, planets that you have within a sign and aspecting that sign from the birth chart, your planetary cycle or your dasha will have a huge influence as well as to how these retrograde phases will be experienced. So by no means is it going to be comprehensive, and there will not be 12 experiences for, everyone on the planet for the 12 rising signs. But at least I can get you pointed in the right direction so that you can look at the houses specifically that might be impacted and see what your experience is. Is this Mercury retrograde really influencing you? So I'll give you lots of dates to note on your calendar. Another few things, I just want to thank everybody who has subscribed to my YouTube channel. This is my 7th podcast, and I appreciate you liking the video. Like I said in my last video, if you like it, literally by clicking the like button, it really helps me to understand that I'm giving you information that you enjoy and find valuable. And also on that note, I have to say, I know I have a very broad audience of listeners from very highly skilled Jyotishis, esteemed scholars of Jyotish, and I have clients and friends and, everything in between, scholars and just starting out with Jyotish. So I'm going to try to offer something for everyone. But what I will say for you folks who are just beginning and who are not necessarily studying in earnest or just starting, that some of the terminology, may not make sense to you. I'm going to try to explain everything in as much detail as I can, but, make note of the things that don't make sense and look them up, look them up online if you're interested. But I'm trying to appeal to a broad audience here. So hopefully you can all hang in there with me. I'll hopefully have something for everyone. Also, I just want to say, Jyotish is based upon the sidereal calculations that I'll be using. And whether you practice Eastern or Western, the dates that I go through for 2018 for the retrograde phases, as well as the aspects and influences to Mercury, while retrograde, that will not change whether you're using an Eastern sidereal system or a Western tropical system. The dates and the influences will not change. What will change is the signs. And so when I talk sign specific is when that won't apply to Western astrology. Things will be a little bit different there. Also, this is a little bit of a longer podcast. I think I ended up with 12 or 13 slides. You have to keep in mind that right now, Mercury is transiting through Sagittarius, and it is moving toward, that's what applying means, moving toward Saturn in the nakshatra of Mula. And Mula is all about getting to the root of things. And Saturn, as you all know, is definitely about the details. So I have a lot of details. I have a lot of history in here, and I hope that you find it interesting as we go along. So let's get started. Here we go. So retrograde motion, for those of you who are unfamiliar, retrograde motion, literally could mean going backwards, right? But planets really don't move backwards. They first go stationary. So from our, heliocentric view, right, as Mercury and the Earth orbit around the sun, it appears that Mercury is starting to go to a direct standstill or stationary before it turns retrograde. Then it turns retrograde. You can see on the picture on the right kind of how that works. So there's also shadow phases as well. So that's the pre-shadow, the shadow, and the post-shadow phase. And that literally is the pre-shadow phase is the degree. Let's say that this is not a real example. I'm just going to give you some random number. So let's say Mercury goes retrograde at 15 degrees of Aries. And it goes retrograde back to 1 degree of Aries. All right. That pre-shadow phase would be the first time that Mercury moves through the first 15 degrees of Aries. Then the retrograde phase would be from 15 degrees of Aries back to 0 degrees of Aries. And then once Mercury goes direct at 0 degrees of Aries, it would move forward those same 15 degrees and it would be direct. That would be the post-shadow phase. It's a little bit complicated without giving you an exact description or a visual for that. But the shadow phases are important and they can be notable. So something that if you want to look up more on that, there's a ton of stuff online that you can find out about shadow phases. But we're going to focus primarily on the retrograde phase. Some of the astrological significations of Mercury retrograde, or any retrograde planet actually, is kind of interesting from the Eastern perspective. It's a little different than Western astrology. It's not better or more right. It's just a little different perspective. Retrograde planets are considered to follow Rahu. If you look at the direct motion of the planets, right, they follow the sun. The sun is the king of the grahas. Rahu, on the other hand, Rahu and Ketu, they actually transit opposite the direction of normal forward-moving planets. And so when planets are retrograde, they're following Rahu. Rahu, right, Ketu being the outcast, being a little less traditional, right, and a little less predictable, right? So there are some of those influences that you can take to retrograde planets. The name for retrograde in Sanskrit is actually Vakri. So that's an important thing to note if you're studying Jyotish in Sanskrit, to have that name associated with the retrograde phase. Retrograde planets in Jyotish are also considered stronger, actually 3 times stronger than direct planets. So that's a big departure from, I think, the Western tradition. But at the same time, strength, it's important to know the detail around it. So what is it strong for? What is it associated with within the individual chart particularly? And that's where you really get into chart analysis, and you can't necessarily put a blanket statement on Mercury retrograde for everybody, because what houses does Mercury rule? Is Mercury going to be strong and amplifying positive dharmic houses and life experiences, or is it going to be stronger and amplifying the dushtanas, or the houses that connect with struggle. And then oftentimes too, retrograde planets, particularly in the birth chart, these last 2 points, can connect to past life experiences, unfulfilled desire from a past life experience particularly. I do have a 3-part article on retrograde planets on elephantjournal.com that was published a few years ago. You can just Google my name and Elephant Journal, Mercury Retrograde, and you can get that article. It's pretty interesting, and this comes from one of my recent Jyotish teachers. And because if you think about retrograde planets, and then also again the direction of Rahu, that's that past life connection, Rahu Ketu, and then also retrograde planets. And then retrograde planets can also have the potential to trigger health issues. Mercury specifically relates to the skin. And so if an individual has Mercury retrograde in the birth chart, you might want to note Mercury retrograde phases by transit and see if that triggers any issues with skin. Sometimes it can be dermatitis, psoriasis, rashes, etc. So something to note about that. And let's just kind of quickly review what are the things that Mercury represents in our day-to-day life. First and foremost, certainly Mercury is the planet of communication, all forms, speech, writing, marketing, books. It connects to business, analytical thinking, and mathematics. It's our hands and arms. It's the planet of astrology and education and certainly prosperity. So those are things to keep in mind as we talk about Mercury. Mercury is Karaka, that's Karaka, or indicator of those things in our lives. Regardless of the houses it owns, you would always look to Mercury for these things first, and then secondarily to the houses that would represent these things in an individual chart. But that's a more advanced concept for those of you who are practicing or studying. 2018 will be interesting because the retrograde phase of Mercury will fall within the water signs, or what is considered in Jyotish the moksha trines. Moksha equals liberation. And, the natural house order from Aries, the moksha trines, represent the 4th, 8th, and 12th houses. And the last time that Mercury was retrograde in the water signs was in 2012. There's like a 6-7 year cycle that Mercury has before it comes back to going retrograde within a specific element. And so this year, all of the water signs will be experiencing this retrograde phase. So the 4th house, right, the natural 4th house connects to the mind, our emotions, our intuition, and it's the piece of sky. The 4th house is a piece of sky that's literally underfoot. It cannot be seen, right? It would be, the other side of the globe, down below. The 8th house is associated with Scorpio, right? All of the, the dark waters that you can't really see underneath, and astrology and the occult, and, people who love mysteries and who love doing research have strong 8th house influences as well. And that's another house that's not visible. And then the 12th house is the house of loss, or Antya Adi, the end of everything. It connects to the end of our body, right, which is our feet, the end of the day, which is sleep, the end of our freedom, which can either be a hospital, a prison, an ashram, right? And then certainly loss that's planned, like charitable works or donations, and philanthropy can be connected to the 12th house as well. So very important to understand the natural indications of the water trines and this retrograde phase that's going to be occurring within there, even though it'll be occurring in different houses, right? These moksha trines, right, that are connected with liberation, that energy will carry through in an underlying manner, regardless of what your rising sign is. So it's very much connected to psychological transformation and the path of liberation and, all kinds of things associated with psychology and occult studies, etc. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your chart. Now, let's look at some key dates for 2018. We have the signs and the nakshatras listed here. So by sign, March 22nd, 2018. This is the retrograde phase that I'm going to focus on. Mercury will go retrograde at 22 degrees, 47 minutes of Pisces, and we'll kind of move through Revati and Uttara Bhadrapada nakshatras. Mercury finally goes direct in April on the 15th at 10 degrees 40 minutes in Uttara Bhadrapada nakshatra. And then the other two retrograde phases are listed here in July and November. If you need to stop the video to take these dates down, you can do so. And like I said, I'm going to focus on the retrograde phase in March and April. So Uttara Bhadrapada Nakshatra, let's look at that first because that's the backdrop from which Mercury will be transiting. Okay, it is certainly transiting through the sign of Pisces, right, which all those 12th house indications that I talked about on the previous slide. But also there will be this influence, right, from the deity associated with Uttara Bhadrapada, so the serpent of the deep. And it's symbolized by either the twins or a snake in the water. And the purpose of this nakshatra, the goal is kama. It's associated with desire. It's a fixed nakshatra. It really is about bringing growth and stability, right? If you think of the rain, the element of bringing rain, that brings growth and stability. And then it's going to be transiting through in the retrograde phase in padas 3 and padas 4, which are associated with kama and moksha. This is a more advanced analysis. So for those of you who are Jyotishis, you would want to look, of course, at the padas as Mercury moves through padas 3 and 4, and then check the house of your chart and what is the goal of that house. Is it dharma, artha, karma, moksha, right? And you can see if this influence is going to be either at a conflict or in harmony with your chart. And that will also help you understand how you might experience this Mercury retrograde phase, particularly if you're in the cycle of Mercury, because Mercury gets activated within the nakshatra of Revati. That's considered Mercury's nakshatra. So particularly for people who are in Mercury sub period or main period or sub period, any one of those could activate this while Mercury is in Revati. And then for those who are in Saturn's cycles, any one of the levels, because Uttara Bhadrapada gets activated by Saturn, any portion of that dasha could activate that, and you could experience this more strongly. But fundamentally, Mercury in Uttara Bhadrapada is very creative. It's a very wonderful placement for Mercury for creative works. And I know, what everybody's thinking, right? Mercury is debilitated in Pisces, right? It's weak in Pisces, but it might be weak for some things, like the rational, analytical thinking part of the mind isn't functioning the same way in Pisces as it does in Virgo, right? Because Virgo is where Mercury is exalted and talk about, a sharp intellect, right? People with Virgo and Mercury and great speakers, etc. Mercury in Pisces is a lot more nebulous. And then adding this backdrop of Uttara Bhadrapada, it can be incredibly creative, right? If you think of the serpents, certainly the Nagas are considered to be very intelligent, but it's more of a creative, emotional, meditative, clairvoyant kind of influence that Mercury experiences here versus in Virgo, the sign of Virgo. All right, so a little bit about Revati. The deity for Revati is Pushan. It's symbolized by the fish, and this nakshatra is associated with moksha. It is a very soft and mild nakshatra. It's associated with spiritual liberation, and Mercury will be going through the first and second padas. So each nakshatra has 4 padas, and they're associated with either dharma, artha, kama, or moksha. And so Mercury will be running through padas 1 and padas 2 during the retrograde phase, so dharma and moksha. And again, check that against your chart and the influences within your own specific chart for those of you who are practiced. All right. And Revati, Pushan is he's a protector of the animals and helps, people and animals travel safely to get from one place to the other. And this is going to be interesting because Mercury retrograde when it's in Revati, and then looking at some of the influences that I'm going to go through in the next couple of slides. We'll see if there isn't some travel delays or, some issues, particularly as it relates to boats and water. I'll go into that a little bit more when I talk about influences. Hopefully I won't forget. All right. So aspects to Mercury. As I said, right out of the gate, Mercury is considered debilitated or weak in Pisces, and particularly Uttara Bhadrapada because it's debilitated at 15 degrees within that nakshatra. But again, like I said, debilitation, there's a lot of different thoughts out there on that. I personally do not think that debilitated planets are quote unquote bad. I really dislike that thought process. For me, I think it really means, where an individual is going to focus more energy in this lifetime, right? It's a planet that hasn't been experienced that much maybe in a previous lifetime, unlike exalted planets, right? So debilitated planets really are a great opportunity for growth within a lifetime. And certainly Mercury can be very creative, particularly for writing and other creative things within the nakshatra of Uttara Bhadrapada. The one thing that will be happening is that there's going to be an aspect from Mars to Mercury in March and April. Actually, I wrote here until May 9th, but that's not right. It's actually a few days earlier that the influence from Mars ends. And Mercury and Mars are not particularly good together. Mercury is easily influenced, right? Mercury is the one planet that's the most changeable and most influenced by planets that it transits with or is aspected by. So Mercury friends, like I have here, take note. Mercury pretty much transiting through the sign of Pisces will be influenced by Mars almost the whole time. And so that will bring a lot of Pitta elements. So if you're Gemini or Virgo rising, just be aware of your Pitta. And certainly, Mars and Mercury combined can give a very sharp mind, but it can also give very cutting speech at the same time. So it's definitely a time you want to count to 10 before you say something. It can give a more impulsive speech, right? The quality of impulsive speech during that time. We'll see how that plays out on the world stage. Now, the one other thing that is coming with this influence of Mars is Venus. Venus is going to be exalted in its, favorite house in Pisces from March 2nd through March 28th. So Mercury will also have the blessing of having, the exalted planet there in Pisces, which technically in Jyotish terms is Nicha Bhanga. It is a cancellation of debilitation. And so that will support Mercury and hopefully help fight off some of the influence from Mars. And then also Rahu, because Rahu is in Cancer right now in the sidereal system and will be in trines to Venus. Okay. So that is Rahu, is the wind element. So we've got the fire element from Mars. We've got the wind element from Rahu, and then the Kapha element from Venus in Pisces. So hopefully they'll all balance each other out. That's what I'm really, really hoping. Because, Rahu, particularly when it connects to Mercury, can affect the mind. It can affect our ability for wise decision making. Okay. And then Mars too, right, can make us impulsive, and Rahu kind of, cast shadows on things. And so during that time, I would just say, not to make impulsive decisions. And if you feel like you aren't getting clarity on the decision-making process and you have something really important that you are considering, find a good friend or trusted, friend or family member to bounce something off of before you make the decision, in case you feel like you aren't thinking clearly, because that certainly could happen, and Mercury's a lot more emotional within the sign of Pisces as well. So that's important to note. And then on May 1st, Mercury will be combust the sun. So that's when, the sun is at the same degree of a planet. The heat of the sun kind of literally burns up the indications of the planet that it connects to or conjuncts with. And so it's more of an internalization of the things that Mercury represents. The combustion generally has more of an influence outwardly, if it connects to a person in an individual's chart. But it's generally more of an internal influence, bringing the sun and the soul and the energy of Mercury together. At the same time, the owner of Pisces, or dispositor, Jupiter, is going to be retrograde the entire time that Mercury is in Pisces. So hopefully, again, that retrograde phase of Jupiter that's stronger, right, will also help support this phase. But again, two retrograde planets, you've got the, a planet in the house and the dispositor of the house. You have to really look at the individual chart to figure out if the impact is going to be something that's considered to be, easy and more favorable, or something that might create unexpected issues. And then I talked about Mercury and Saturn nakshatras, right? Because of Uttara Bhadrapada and Revati, those two nakshatras. Anybody who's running Mercury or Saturn periods might experience this retrograde phase more strongly than others. Now, we talked about some of the difficult influence potentially. For those of you who aren't familiar with yantras, these are literally devices that you can use to meditate and help create ease. This is the Mercury Yantra. My friend and client, Alyssa Tassar, who has so kindly allowed me to use her picture of her with her Mercury laptop skin. She's a great healer, by the way. She lives in Wisconsin, and you can Google her if you are looking for a wonderful coach or someone to help you with transformation in your life. She's a terrific coach, and I highly recommend her. But anyway, Mercury Yantra as well, to help support all of the indications of Mercury during this Mercury retrograde phase, or at any point in your life, if you feel like you are struggling with some of the issues and indications that I talked about earlier, right? Communication, writing, speech, business, etc. You can work with the Mercury Yantra as a meditation. Just having it in your space can help align with the pure vibration and energy of the planet Mercury. All right. Now, influences by rising sign. Like I said, this was a request that I had from many people, and I had a hard time trying to figure out how I was going to do this. Again, this is one of those slides where I would say, put the video on pause, and you can take a screenshot, or you can, whatever you want to do, write it down for your sign specifically. But starting with Aries, okay, so you can see the rising sign in parentheses, and then to the left of it, you'll see a number. That's a house number. So Mercury for Aries rising will be retrograde in the 12th house, Pisces, which is associated with charity, loss, sleep, isolation. And then in parentheses to the right, you can see for all of the rising signs, I have also see houses 3 and 6, because for Aries rising, Mercury owns the 3rd and the 6th houses. So that will tie in courage, younger siblings, communication, 3rd house, as well as 6th house, work, service, daily routines, so Shadripus, the 6 enemies, to the 12th house and the influence of this retrograde phase. Okay, all 3 of those houses are going to be significant in this retrograde phase. And again, I'm giving a lot of detail here, but ultimately, unless you're an astrologer, you may have a difficult time interpreting this influence within your own chart. But if you can at least take the keywords, right, that I've given you here for each rising sign, you have to know your rising sign. And then look at the different influences to the chart at that time. You can see if anything is coming up specifically around these things in your life. And I'm not going to talk through each one of them. Like I said, you are welcome to stop the screen and take a screenshot, etc. And so I hope that helps. I would love feedback from those of you who have requested the forecast by rising sign. This is kind of, I think, the most detail I could possibly give. Okay, so please write in your comments what you think. Okay, all right. Now, again, like I said, the influence by rising sign is very specific. And for Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, these retrograde phases, and specifically the one in March as well, is going to be falling into the moksha trines. And I give the house numbers there, and I also give it on the previous slide. For Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, it's going to be falling within the kama trines, the houses of desire, right? And that's kind of interesting, right? Because for Taurus rising, the houses of desire are associated with different influences than what Pisces is normally associated, right, with moksha. So there is a little bit of a polarity, right, for anybody who's not Aries, Leo, or Sagittarius rising, right, because those are the natural moksha trines for those people. Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, the retrogrades will fall into the Arcta trines, so the 2, 6, and 10 houses. And Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces, the retrograde phase will fall in the Dharma trines, so 1, 5, and 9. And Gemini and Virgo, again, take note, right, for anyone with Sun, Moon, and Ascendant in Mercury ruled signs as well. That's something really significant because you have a lot of involvement with Mercury in your charts, okay? And that's it. So I hope this has been of value to you. I'm trying to share as much as I can in a way that will speak to a broad audience. And I would love your feedback. I have lots of requests for future podcasts. I'll be doing something on the Mars retrograde phase for sure. That is a very important retrograde, and it's not something that occurs, as much as Mercury. It's like just about every two years plus that Mars goes retrograde. Mercury goes retrograde 3 times a year, like clockwork. So it's certainly a lot more significant as it relates to the movement of Mars specifically. And I guess that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I'll look forward to seeing y'all on Facebook or next time around on my podcast. Have a great day. Bye-bye.